button points left and right sides.
Up is the slide.
But one thing worth noting is that the BLM this year we are changing. I used to oversee the soil, water, air, and riparian program. They've now become the aquatic habitat management program. Left and right.
I just tested it on Teams. It worked.
All right. So here's our surface estate. We have about 8 million acres, and it's spread everywhere. We've got 113,000 acres of riparian wetland, over 1,100 miles of perennial stream, tens of thousands of miles of intermittent ephemeral stream, some of which contain riparian, some of which don't. All of this is managed by 5 hydrologists, 3 fish biologists, and then a handful of seasonal techs that we get every year. So we've got to be pretty efficient how we manage these systems. And so there's our general process for doing it. We call it the integrated riparian management process, but it's really just a combination of qualitative assessments with quantitative data and adaptive management at the bottom. And so we start this out by, we walk our creeks. We go to a watershed. We're going to walk our streams. We're looking at visual indicators of condition, and we're doing what's called the proper functioning condition assessment. It's just a checklist of individual characteristics that we're looking at to determine a general rating for this kind of system. So it's either on the worst end of the scenario, it's not functioning, so it's not meeting the resource values that we desire for that, or it's functioning at risk with an upward downward trend or proper functioning condition. And that's our standard regulatory framework. So everything has to be either functioning at risk up or PFC. And so at the same time, we're typically looking at resource values, right? So if you're going to be managing the systems, not everything's equal. So we're looking at things like if this is a particular habitat for an important species or a candidate species, starting endangered species. Is this a municipal watershed? Bunch of different things that we consider. And then in the end, we have an ID team, so a wildlife biologist, a hydrologist, a very diverse group of people get together and they say, all right, well, what do we have here and what are we going to do with it? And we're kind of ranking these into our actions. So some systems, we kind of have pretty clear indicators that we can move forward and do a restoration project. We may identify a site that needs to have adaptive grazing management, and we'll follow it up with some monitoring. And so some examples up here would be this photo on the upper left. It's an incised channel. It's crossed its functional threshold. We're not going to spend a lot of time working on that because it's already gone. We lost it, and it'd be really expensive to fix it, and we just wouldn't get our money out of it. The cost benefit isn't there. On the flip side, on the upper right hand photo, we have a stream that's it's already in good condition. It's pretty insensitive to management. It's dissipating its energy through rocks and large woody debris, and so if we're thinking about a grazing system, it's not something that we're really concerned about. On the bottom photo, though, we have a stream here that's rated functioning at risk on a downward trend. It's got important habitat. It's sensitive to management because it's got fine-grained soils. It's a low gradient system where cattle like to spend their time, and it hasn't quite crossed a threshold yet. So, we're going to try to recover that before it crosses that threshold. We're going to spend our time and energy there. And so in this example here, we're going to then go out and collect baseline data, and we're going to be looking at the indicators that are sensitive to what we identified earlier in our previous assessments. We're going to then, implement the actions. This could be putting off-site water, some exclosures, changing the time and duration or frequency of grazing, and we're going to then monitor those effects. And we'll typically do short-term indicators of use. This is like stream bank alteration, stubble height, woody browse, because that's a direct measure of what we're doing that year. And then we're going to be relating that to long-term indicators of condition, and I'll get more into that later. And so that cycle loops back and forth until we kind of derive at a system where we're getting an increased at an improving trend. And then we're going to kind of hold those indicators of condition where they are, or I'm sorry, of use where they are. So I kind of like this cartoon here. So we, what are we going to monitor? Well, this guy, this boss is telling his employee, get all the information you can. We'll think of a use for it later. And I see that kind of often. And in the land management business, we don't have the time and resources to do that. We need to be collecting data from locations that are sensitive to the management that we are implementing and that are going to be providing insight to that specific question. So one of the ways that I find it useful to communicate these indicators is through a conceptual model. Here's a channel evolution model for an alluvial stream. So these are the types of streams that we commonly have our biggest issues because these streams really need the vegetation for their stability. And so the indicators that we're going to look at are those that change through each sequence. And so if we can look at those things that are changing through each sequence and monitor them, then we're going to have a much better ability to not only interpret the data and understand what it's meaning, but also prioritize our actions. So in this model, the general concept is that you start with a system that's dynamically stable, and then as you have some perturbations, you have some consistent changes that occur through time. And so many of these changes are reversible. For example, from state A to state B, if you catch it here and you fix it, you can get back. But if it declines far enough, you're going to cross a functional threshold, and the best that you can do is end up down here. So in each one of these changes, you're going to have corresponding changes in the hydrology, the geomorphology, and the vegetation. And those are some of the indicators that we're going to look at. So in state A, we have the stream channel that has a great connection to its floodplain, right? It's got stabilizing plant communities along the channel margins, and those hydric species kind of grade out into more of your facultative, fac-wet, and facultative species as you go out further on the floodplain. And when this system floods, the water depths never get very high, so the stream power isn't all that great. The vegetation is going to slow that water down. It's going to capture those nutrients, that sediment, and it's going to build up your banks. You're going to get recharge out in floodplains so that when you're in those later summer months, you're going to have that water coming back to base flow, and it's going to support those hydric species even further. And this is going to be a system that's really resistant to flooding. It's got all the pieces that it needs to function appropriately. But if you don't manage it right, you get some changes, and you're going to end up in this state B, which is a functioning at risk state. First thing that you're going to see is a change in your channel capacity. So when your channel capacity increases, the same amount of water that used to cause overbank flooding in state A is going to be stuck there in the channel. So you're no longer building those nutrients up on your banks. You are no longer hydrating the bank storage in that floodplain at the same rate that you were before. And you're also getting a big reduction in your stabilizing plant communities. So you're now getting some of these shallow-rooted, earlier sterile plant communities that just can't hold it together as well. And while this is reversible, if you do not address it, you're going to end up in cross this threshold, essentially, and have an incision event. And at this point, you've lost. You have a disconnected floodplain. You're draining your riparian soils. You've lost all of your riparian plant communities that were previously supported. And it's going to just be cycling with major adjustments on each flood. And so if we're going to prioritize our actions here, I'm going to spend my time on this state B. Here's what we're going to focus on. And in this grazing scenario, we're going to be looking at those three indicators of use, this woody brow, stubble height, and bank alteration. And we're going to be relating them to these long-term indicators of trend. So one of the first things that we'll typically see is this species composition change. This is going to be your kind of leading indicator here. You're going to have a reduction in your wetland rating, your stability rating, your sterile status, and you're also going to have an expanded green line width. And what we're going to try to do, if we're managing appropriately, is watch those change the other direction. Up here on the state A, we're probably not going to spend a lot of time because our current management is already good. Unless there's some compelling reason, like it's important habitat, and we're perhaps maybe not at those objectives yet. So, we might be looking at species composition versus the geomorphic surface. One of the problems I see with a lot of the riparian monitoring is when people do cross sections, they end up lumping it all together, and you lose a lot of the resolution of information because each geomorphic surface essentially supports a different plant community. And so if you separate them out, you can get a lot more information. And you can get decent information just qualitatively by doing a step point line. I mean, in 5 minutes, you can get an estimate of what's there in a general abundance per geomorphic surface. I'm also going to be looking at the percentage of stabilizers along your green line. Most of these fine-grained sediment banks and these low-gradient systems, you're looking probably 70–90% stabilizers to maintain its stability through flooding in time. Down here at this non-functional state, changes are going to be happening so rapidly that you can probably document with a photo. I mean, each flood, those banks are going to be sloughing off and calving into your channel. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time monitoring that. I mean, and the best you can do is take it to a new incised state. So it's just not really going to be sensitive to your management at that point. I'll probably instead be looking at more of like management concerns, like what infrastructure is upstream of this head cut. Is it going to be beneficial or cost effective to fix that head cut before it hits that infrastructure, or should we just let it rip? If after you're in that incised state, those banks are going to calve off, and you're going to slowly expand your riparian or the capacity or the width of that inset floodplain, and your stream power is going to slowly decline because now that water can spread out somewhat. As that's happening, you're going to start getting some deposits that are forming, and you're going to see these colonizing species start to move into these deposits. But in each progressive flood, it's still going to be wiping it out. You're still not at a state where you can get a stable dimension pattern and profile. And so in each new flood, you're still getting a lot of adjustments until you finally get a point where that inset floodplain is wide enough for that water to spread out and start depositing all of that sediment. And so when you hit the state E, that's typically what's happened. And one of the first indicators that you're there is that you'll see these stabilizing plant communities starting to move into those colonizing species. And what will happen is that those are able to hold those deposits in place long enough that you can start developing a new channel pattern. So essentially this will be sinuosity in this system. And that does a number of things. One, you start getting lateral dissipation of energy, and it also reduces your slope effectively. When you increase sinuosity, you reduce slope, so you're then reducing the velocity of that water, and so you're reducing the forces in that system. So you're rebalancing the driving and resisting forces. And so you're starting to get to a functioning state. If you're seeing a lot of these stabilizers come in, you may be at a PFC, but you're probably more likely at a functioning or risk state, because you could get, if, God forbid, a 50-year flood come in, it could still send you back the other way. If it stays in a state long enough and you're managing it appropriately, you're now going to be getting new deposits. So each progressive flood, the water's spreading out. You're going to be now getting more deposits of sediment up on top of your bank, and you're going to start building and building, and you're going to have the stabilizers nearly completely take over your stream channel. And when that happens, your green line width is going to start narrowing, because those are staying in place long enough for them to be capturing more and more sediment. You're going to get a stable dimension pattern and profile, so you're not going to be seeing the meander chute cutoffs like you may in the state E. You're going to see the riparian extent going outwards to probably the toe of your new inset floodplain. And you're also going to be seeing it move in, like I was saying, your channel narrowing. And then at this state, you're going to have you're going to be at a high resistance to flooding. You're not going to be as sensitive as you were before. So again, like on the previous slide, I'm going to spend my time in the state E because this can still get worse if you don't manage it appropriately. We'll be looking at a lot of the same indicators as before, but you're also going to start seeing some changes in the substrate, because as you are changing, as you've moved the sediments, the fine sediments that were eroding from those banks before through the system, you're going to start seeing more of your coarser substrate come out. And then like I'll say with the sinuosity, your longitudinal profile is going to start changing. We do most of the monitoring of those indicators I mentioned previously with a protocol called multiple indicator monitoring. And it's a technical reference here that I put in very small print, TR1737-23. You can find it online. And it's kind of depicted here in this photo on the upper right. Basically, we're measuring these indicators along the green line, which is that first lineal grouping of perennial vegetation, at quadrats. So these are our quadrats, so we're spacing these 2.5 meters, and we're measuring all of these variables: stubble height, bank alteration, woody browse, green line vegetation, bank stability, woody regeneration, right there all at one time. And then in the cross sections, we're getting green line width, substrate, thowag profile, and pool depth and frequency. And with this raw data, we're feeding it through an automated data analysis module that produces a bunch of other useful management information. So green line ecological status rating just from the species composition, site wetland rating, windward green line stability rating. If you add in the height class of your shrubs, you can get a shade cover index. So a lot of useful indicators just from the raw data. One of the reasons that I really like this protocol is that it is built on this philosophy here. Since most of the cost of monitoring is getting there, you should do these things. Do multiple indicators at a time. If you're already at a plot, collect the extra indicator. I mean, you're literally talking about a few extra minutes if you're doing it efficiently. So that's why all these are done at one plot. And when you're good, you're just calling one number out after another. Indicators that are quickly observed. There's a lot of different things that you can look at, but you have to weigh the cost and benefit and time when you're looking at them. A lot of things tell you similar information about the channel, and some may be a lot harder to collect than others. Tied to important biophysical processes, that's the stuff that we covered in those previous 2 slides with the channel evolution. And then collect it with electronic recorders, guys. It takes a lot of time to transpose your information digitally now, and you miss a lot of information because if you're using an electronic recorder, you often have defined domains and schema. So if you're looking at, YES, someone may have a lowercase y and someone may have an uppercase y when they transpose it in, and it screws up the whole database. And so you do it this way, and it works fluidly, and it takes something that would take an hour to put it in there to being a few minutes. We're measuring long-term indicators concurrently with short-term indicators, so we get cause and effect. I think that's rather important. Early indicators of change. So one of the reasons we measure here on the green line is because that's where you first see changes in a stream channel. It's not further up on the bank. It's right there at those margins. And so it's like the canary in the coal mine. Another reason that we measure there is because the soil moisture gradients are more normalized. They're much more stable there. So you're capturing more of your change in actual condition instead of interannual variability of precipitation and stream flow. And then another thing that I often see in some of the protocols is that they're not doing the statistical testing that you have to do. They need to be accurate enough and precise enough to make statistically significant observations of change in a period that's useful to management. And so that needs to be related to how much a system changes in a certain number of years. And so, an example is we have grazing permit renewals every 10 years, right? And we're going to want to have a change. We're going to say we implemented these changes, and here's what it did. We need to be able to see changes in probably a 3 to 5 year cycle. So by 10 years, we can have a few data points. And we can do that by looking at 2 types of variance. We have one confidence interval, so CL2 down here. This is basically the between user variability. So you have 2 different groups measuring the same stream, same location, same time. How similar are those measurements going to be? Because we are going to, we have turnover. One group's going to measure it in year 1, 5 years later, it's going to be a whole different group of people measuring that site. You need to know this stuff in order to know statistical change. So those are based on standardized studies that we did, that the National Riparian Service Team and other groups did. But so here, this is saying that you're 95% certain that the measure that you're getting with woody browse is going to be 5% of the value that you get. So if you get a value that's greater than that, if a change is greater than that, then that's statistically significant. The other confidence interval is from the data itself. Different data have different levels of variance, and so you also have to account for that. I think that you can take these same concepts and use them for wetlands. So I just took one example for a slope wetland, just to kind of present this idea here. So here is a slope wetland. The upper right-hand photo is a proper functioning slope wetland. It's got diffuse flow. It's kind of like almost like a trampoline of water underneath it, right? And what's happened in a lot of these is that for the past 200 years, 150 years, we've had wagon trails go up them. We've had livestock trailing go up them. And all of these puncture it essentially and create these confined flow paths. So what used to be diffuse flow now becomes concentrated flow. And over time, that creates head cuts. So down in the bottom right is an example of one such thing. So here in the middle, our Dillon field office actually was out here last fall, and they noticed in this cattle trail the water had thawed out during the afternoon, and they came out in the next morning, and it was frozen in there, so you could see how that water was moving through the system through these trails. And right beneath all this, it was a head cut. And so here's kind of a conceptual diagram of a degradation pathway. So using those same concepts, what is physically changing here? And how can we use this to determine what we should monitor? So, here's that state A, this initial state. It's in proper functioning condition. You got dispersed perennial flow. The hydric vegetation is covering that saturated zone, and then you probably have a gradation into some of the fac wet and facultative plants out from there. But you don't have any of that concentrated flow forming. And this state B here in the middle, you've now got concentrated flow paths. And I think that there's kind of a middle state. What I see is, I just didn't have time to make a new diagram, but what happens is you'll have these initial concentrated flow paths form, but they don't connect. You'll just see like a section of it and then a section of it. And eventually those will connect, and when they connect, then you start getting the head cutting. And I would consider that to be the exact time that you take action. I mean, that's when you should be acting, because once you get to this this middle state, your concentrated flow paths have already connected. You've already had a small head cut move through there. Those head cuts are now draining the groundwater, and they're moving it out of the system. So you used to have all this water, think of it as like potential energy. Now you've converted it to kinetic energy, and it's eroding. So you're then going to see that in your species composition changes, and in time you get enough floods that's going to continue to incise. You're going to drain your system completely. You're going to see that the species composition is really now upland, and the duration of growth is going to be greatly changed, because now it's dependent on precipitation for getting its water instead of actually having its roots wet into the subsurface. So, what does all this mean? I guess some of the things that I would put as lessons learned, are right here. So you got to be able to read your systems. If you're collecting data, you can't make use of it if you don't have a well-formed concept of how it all fits together in time. A lot of people think of just space, but you got to know what the current condition is, what it has been, and what it could be in order to manage it. You got to know all of those processes in between to really put the data together in a meaningful way. I'd also recommend focusing on processes and functions and not resource values. I see a lot of times when I'm working with our fish biologists, they want to measure the fish and the things that those fish are doing, but those are really, there's a lot more noise in that connection there. And if you focus on the functions and you get those right, they're going to produce the desired resource values. So I think that you can probably get a much more meaningful information much faster if you do that. Don't look for the silver bullet. Even in the BLM, I see this all the time, especially at our national level. They're looking for that one monitoring protocol, or even like you just described, that does everything for everybody. It's silly. You need to have standardized data collection, but you need to have an assessment methodology for a certain purpose. You need to have monitoring for a certain purpose. And you should have several, so that when you have unique situations, you can choose the one that's most appropriate for that. Use staff efficiently. I see this all the time in the BLM, even here. Use your professional ID teams to do the assessments and you set your goals and objectives and you identify your monitoring sites, that takes a lot of professional judgment, and you only get that with experience. You're not going to bring someone in from the East Coast with a hydrology degree to like spend 3 months here in Montana and be able to do this for your streams. But what they can do is they can follow protocol. So if you do all of this stuff first and then give them a cookbook monitoring protocol that you've trained them in for a week or so, you can turn them loose on your monitoring sites. And I find that to be an efficient way to do it. I think I've already covered these other things down here. And then I like to leave people with pretty pictures of hope. So,
Great timing.
I don't know if you want me to do questions.
Yeah, you pick the questions now.
Alden, on your sort of quick always do it, do you include digital photos in that list? I mean, I've always thought that kind of pictures 1,000 words is really holds true with this stuff.
Always. And increasingly, I'm pushing them to have them monumented. I've seen some of the photo bars that, like, even in Yellowstone, I saw them recently, where they have like the angle iron on it, and it's hammered to the ground where so you come put your camera on that angle iron, snap your photo. I think that having something like that where it's always at the same place is pretty awesome, pretty good idea. But always photos.
Alden, your talk focused on monitoring and how you should focus your monitoring. But I also heard a little something that was disturbing to me, which is on those bad sites you just walk away. I can understand that from a monitoring standpoint, but from a resource standpoint, should you just walk away from the management practices as well?
If I had more time, I would have put in a few slides about prioritizing. I was trying to slam a bunch all together there, but I would have ranked priorities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of where we would start. And so I would start at those high priority things that you can change before they cross functions. And if you've hammered those out and you're good with those, then you start moving down the list to those non-functional sites. It's really just an allocation of resources. It's triage. If it's going to cost, if you can save 5 sites with $100 versus 1 site for $1,000, what are you going to do? And so it's not that I don't think that's important, but it's just more of just a resource management side. Not just natural resources, but a dollar resource management. Yes.
Is your monitoring and with PFC, is that starting to incorporate, I guess what they're calling in the Northwest, the stage 0 concept, where basically, because that whole Shallcross model seems very antiquated, really.
It's before
because
stage
stage
0.
A, the best, is still reflecting a system that's been altered for the last 180 years after
Right.
90+% beaver version. So,
Yep.
are you guys starting to consider that, and that actually some of those, like, I agree, actually, from a restoration standpoint, I see the stage C, and I just start drooling at those big high banks, and there's so much sediment to work with, and build that up only takes, a few years. But I think there's a lot of potential to work in this concept of where can we actually put it back to what is actually natural, and not the single thread Rosgani thing, So,
Yes, we are. We are certainly looking at state 0. Absolutely. I was just time pressed and didn't have time to build that one myself. I had to pull it from their slide. But I agree. The channel evolution, especially the shroom stuff, is really before we started looking at the multi-threaded channels, the beaver dominated system.